Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Near and Rupar, where we'll give folks a moment to file in, but we will get started in just a few seconds. Well, thank you as always for joining us on a Friday afternoon here on Near and Rupar, the weekly live stream hosted by myself, David Near, publisher of The Down Ballot, and Aaron Rupar, publisher of Public Notice. We talk about just about everything under the sun in politics, from the biggest national stories to the down ballot news, making waves in important races that will be on the ballot in next year's midterms. But this week, it feels like the sun has been blotted out by one name, and that is Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say Barack Obama there for a minute, and we were going to go down the Obamagate 2.0 that Trump wants us to be talking about. But
We should
you're
talk about
absolutely
that
right.
too.
We should, and it's actually I did a stream a few days ago with Rick Wilson, and it was a lot of fun. But I at one point brought up the Obamagate 2.0 stuff, and he kind of shut me down. He's like, "We're not even going to acknowledge this by unpacking it. I don't even want to talk about it. It's nonsense." Which I think is kind of valid, because it is nonsense. But it's also kind of interesting to unpack because I think it speaks to the desperation that Trump has to distract from the Epstein developments. But David, have you guys at the down ballot found a down ballot angle for Epstein yet, or have you been safely ignoring it to this point?
So, believe it or not, we actually did, because Congressman Thomas Massey, the very eccentric, libertarianish, Ron Paul style Republican, whom Trump hates because he often votes against GOP priorities from the right or from his own sort of personal worldview. Trump has targeted Thomas Massey in next year's primary. He wants someone to run. No one's running yet, but he wants someone to unseat Thomas Massey, some more compliant MAGA type. And Trump's allies have already been dumping tons of money, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions at this point, into ads against Massey, even though we're, a year away from the primary. But Massey started fighting back with ads of his own. And we just wrote about it in today's newsletter.
I saw that.
And Massey's ad, he talks about, says, I've opposed, bad spending bills from both parties. And then he says, and I'm leading the way to force the Epstein files to be released. And I'm like, you go, Thomas Massey, make common cause here. And so he has this tool that he's using called the discharge petition, which you hear about sometimes in the House. What it is a method for members of the House to bypass leadership and force something to come to a vote if they get signatures from a majority of members of the House, which is 218. And obviously, the House GOP leadership, the entire GOP leadership, does not want to talk about Epstein. But Thomas Massey is more than happy to keep pushing this. And so on his petition, his discharge petition, he's already gotten several dozen signatures, including from Democrats and Republicans. And the wild thing, Aaron, is the spectrum of co-sponsors ranges from Lauren Boebert to Rashida Tlaib. It's across the gamut. So yeah, there is a down ballot angle to this, and I think we're going to see a lot more of this. And look, someone in comments said, in what universe are we cheering for Thomas Massey? This completely fucked up one. Because when you are in a situation where everything is on the line, where everything is existential, where democracy is really up for grabs, being part of a popular front means sometimes you make common cause with the most disgusting people. And that's what's happening right here.
Yeah, and the thing that's been kind of surreal to me, observing how much this Epstein scandal has blown up and really become a grave threat to Trump, is that so much of this was out there, 5-6 years ago. And one of the clips that really kind of was jarring for me to see this week was, I think it was Brian Tyler Cohen was resurfacing some of Trump's interview with Jonathan Swan, which people probably remember from the summer of 2020. Swan at the time, I believe, was working with HBO, and he did this very hard-hitting interview with Trump, which really kind of stands out because Trump so infrequently is in a setting like that where he's actually being challenged and kind of exposed. But that interview took place shortly after the COVID briefing where Trump was asked about Ghislaine Maxwell, who I believe at that time had just been Either she had been arrested or charged. She was in the news for some reason at that point. And Trump was asked about her, and he had the very infamous comment where he said, "I just wish her well," or something to that extent. So, and
Right,
Swan,
right.
and so Swan in this interview, challenged Trump to kind of explain, basically kind of framing it like, look, she's accused of horrendous crimes, and like, is it really appropriate to wish her well? And Trump, he sounded so guilty in his reply because, he got
Huh.
very defensive. And his line was basically like, anybody who's in prison, I don't want anything bad to happen to them. And I knew her many years ago. And so, of course, I wish her well. But, my tone isn't really doing it justice because he kind of had that excited sort of defensive tone. And it really it's surprising to me that all these years later it's become this huge threat to Trump when the facts were out there. Now, of course, I think what happened this time around is that this is a problem largely of the Trump administration's own creation. And you and I know in previous episodes talked about kind of the cabinet of clowns that Trump has, and that has a lot of bad implications for governance and kind of the state of the federal government more broadly. But I think one of the downsides that it has for Trump is that he put someone like Kash Patel in charge of the FBI. Dan Bongino. I mean, these are guys who built audiences and really kind of rode the Epstein conspiracies to fame. And so then when you put them, in charge of these law enforcement agencies, like of course people are going to expect transparency and them to follow through on some of the things that they talked about for years on podcasts. Because Trump himself didn't really campaign on the Epstein files whatsoever. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, he talked about it one time during the campaign in October during a Fox News interview. And even then, he was basically like, well, we'll release whatever is pertinent, but, we have to protect the innocent and this and that. It's kind of the line that he's using right now. But because you had guys like Bongino and Kash Patel in these positions, of course, there were demands for transparency. And then you had Pam Bondi stepping in February during the Fox News interview where she said, I have the Epstein documents right on my desk and I'll be releasing them
Right.
shortly. You had the fiasco with the right-wing influencers who got the binders of documents where it turned out that they had all been public record already. You had the fiasco with the jailhouse tape, which, Wired did a big report on how that had been tampered with, basically put into like a video editing software. And, there was a missing minute that I don't think has ever really been fully explained what's going on there. So now there's this perception of a cover up. And I can't help but wonder, if Trump had just stocked his administration with more kind of standard Republican, I mean, I was going to say James Comey, but not someone like him, but, kind of a MAGA law enforcement personality, if this would have turned out as badly as it did for him. But he kind of, in hindsight, I don't think he maybe foresaw that, but he was kind of asking for it just with the conspiratorial people that he put in his administration, the demand that the base would have for them to follow through on the claims of transparency, the demands that they were making when they were in the private sector. And now here we are. So, I think my view on it is that I'm still concerned that the cover up here will end up working. There's been a lot of talk this week about Todd Blanche, the deputy AG, meeting with Ghislaine Maxwell yesterday and today. Certainly based on some of what Pam Bondi has said on social media, what Blanche has said on X, it very much has the whiff of them trying to kind of coordinate stories. You had Trump today with a very odd response when he was asked about possibly pardoning Ghislaine Maxwell, and he said, I'm allowed to do it, basically kind of leaving the door open. So you can kind of see, a chain of events, and I don't want to go too down the rabbit hole of conjecture here, but where if she does testify, you could see you're kind of trying to spill the tea on someone like Bill Clinton or other Democrats, and that kind of being used as trying to satisfy some of the demands that the base has, for more light to be shed on these conspiracy theories. But Trump kind of using that, maybe with the promise of a pardon, maybe some other concessions to Maxwell while she's in prison. To give her something and then to try to allow Trump to kind of wriggle out of this. So, you mentioned the discharge petition and the fact that there are a lot of Republicans who are supporting that. Someone like Massey, to me, it seems like the bridge is pretty much burned for him at this point. I could see him being the voice that kind of maintains, kind of calls out the cover up for what it is. But, I'd be very surprised when the chips are down if someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Tim Burchett or Lauren Boebert, if they ultimately don't kind of get back on side with Trump and go along with the cover up. I hope that I am wrong on that. But of course, Mike Johnson canceled Congress for basically 6 weeks, in part to avoid the discharge position, the demand for more transparency on Epstein. So, they do have a little bit of time here. I'm sure Trump is kind of hoping that things will die down. But, it doesn't seem like that's going to happen based on even today, this press availability he did before flying to Scotland, where he was being peppered with questions about it.
Just a reminder, if you're a paid subscriber of either of our publications, my site, The Down Ballot, or Aaron's site, Public Notice, you can participate in our Q&A or also just drop in comments. So, Aaron, to that point about the cover up, my
Oh, David, we
feeling,
are kind of losing you a little bit.
oh
You're frozen
no,
up on your end. I hear you
still?
now.
How about now?
There you go. You're back.
All right,
I see it. Okay,
good.
we're good.
So the cover up is starting to work a little too well, huh?
Yeah, I guess right. Yeah.
But here's the thing. My feeling is that the cover up, it almost doesn't matter what they're covering up. It almost doesn't matter what is in these files, what it says about Trump, because what matters right now is that this is the ultimate classic wedge issue. And Republicans are always so good, have been for my lifetime, so good at pushing wedge issues that divide Democrats from one another. And this is a really rare opportunity where Democrats have the chance to turn the tables. And I think they're doing a shockingly good job at it. They're
Mhm.
even Hakeem Jeffries, who's usually acts like he's too above this. Hakeem Jeffries, the Democrats' leader in the House, doesn't like to get his hands dirty with this kind of stuff. He's been pushing Democrats to
Yes.
push the story about the Trump cover up of whatever's in the Epstein files. And there's this justly famous construction. I wish I knew who to attribute it to, but it's, the I never imagined the leopards would eat my face, said the
Yeah.
person voting for the leopards eating people's faces party. Well, what we have now is leopards eating leopards' faces party. And that this gets to your point, Aaron. Trump has absolutely reaped what he sowed. Even if he didn't
Yes.
personally talk much about Epstein, the entire MAGA movement is based on this kind of conspiratorial thinking. And he elevated people who really, really care about this. And to me, the most interesting part of all of this is the split in the MAGA movement, because you have the MAGA influencer types who are willing to play ball, like Charlie Kirk, for instance, who runs the kind of youth group, Turning Point USA, and they're trying to pretend to be all on board with Trump's various distractions and misdirections and saying it's time to move on from this stuff. But
Mhm.
the truer believers are not happy about this at all. And they are continuing to push this stuff. I mean, God, I even saw yesterday, Aaron, remember the MAGA shaman, that maniac
Yep.
from the Jan 6 attacks on the Capitol, who was, dressed in the Viking helmet with the horns and had the makeup on his face. Even he's saying, fuck Trump now, because they're
Yeah.
so upset about this. And so it doesn't really matter what's at the bottom of the rabbit hole. What matters for Democrats is that they keep the GOP wrong footed, and hopefully they just turn some people off to the idea of supporting Donald Trump at all, because he's turned
Nope.
out
We're
not to be
losing you
the
a little bit,
guy that
David.
you talked.
I followed the Yeah, I followed the broad contours there of what you were saying, and I will say that I've noticed a bit of a shift this week, just with the amount of right wing media that I watch. Where I posted something today where yesterday on Fox Business, the total mentions of Obama versus Epstein, it was something like 110-5. Where they're really all in on the Obama stuff as like the biggest scandal of all time, and Epstein paled in comparison, so we're not going to talk about it. I've noticed with Benny Johnson, who was a big Epstein conspiracy theory guy, that he's kind of moved on now, and is talking about the Obama allegations quite a bit as kind of a way to deflect. So, like, again, I'm still kind of skeptical that when the chips are down, that, even like the QAnon shaman, that, ultimately they're not going to kind of get back on side with Trump. I hope that I'm wrong on that. But I will say, the fact pattern here in certain ways for Trump is starting to look worse and worse for him, where, this letter is revealed that the Wall Street Journal breaks news about last week, that Trump wrote to Jeffrey Epstein for his 50th birthday. And, the word body was used quite a bit, which is not a word that's usually in my vocabulary, but, I think that was even in the journals reporting about this. And, where apparently he signed his name, in a way that was meant to represent pubic hair on a woman. And then, of course, Trump, his immediate response was, it's a hoax. I'm suing. He filed a lawsuit. And
Yeah.
then there's additional reporting yesterday that there's a letter from Ghislaine Maxwell that was kind of like a forward to this book that alludes to Trump's letter. And so and then there's also information from one of the Epstein victims' lawyers who was on MSNBC. I believe this was 2 nights ago, where he was talking about how this book is apparently in the possession of the Epstein estate, and the lawyers who are representing the estate would be happy to turn it over. Now that kind of raises questions like, if they turn it over to the FBI, Is the FBI going to try and cover it up? They probably best off leaking that to reporters if they really wanted to get out there. But now, the reason that I go through all of this is because Trump was asked about the letter today by a reporter who basically said, "Are you still maintaining that you did not write a letter to Jeffrey Epstein?" And immediately he went to, "Someone might have written a letter and
Right.
signed my name, forged my name." We're about like a news cycle away from claiming that Biden's auto pen did it or something like that. It's getting more and more outlandish, but so, if this was kind of like normal politics, I mean, he just seems as guilty as can be. And, the lies are becoming more and more outrageous. And so, you also wonder when you look back at the timeline of the reporting here, where, last week the Journal drops this explosive story about the letter that Trump wrote to Epstein. And then this week they followed up on that, with a follow up report that had four different the report this week was about Trump being named in the Epstein files and the reporting about how Pam Bondi told Trump about this in May. And then Trump lied about that. Later on when he was asked directly, did Pam Bondi tell you that you're in the Epstein files? And he said no. Apparently he was told that he was in May. All of the reporters on these two different stories were different reporters. And so his claim in his lawsuit is that they're basically fabricating this. Well, is the whole Wall Street Journal newsroom in on this? You have
Right.
8 reporters and editors kind of and so the fact that they described the letter in such detail, it seems like they had to have seen it. Just the way that they wrote about it, they
Oh
didn't
yeah.
publish it. And so you just kind of, you just kind of wonder what else they have, what other bombshells are coming. And, Trump, the way that the flop show is kind of mounting here and the outrageousness of the lies is increasing, it seems like maybe there's some awareness that there's more coming. And so, it really is kind of, I hate to say kind of stay tuned, but, it seems like that's kind of where we're at with this. And, and now the New York Times is matching a lot of the reporting from the Journal. So, you have two different newsrooms on this. And then, there's kind of the dizziness that occurs when you process that, you have one part of the Murdoch empire, the Wall Street Journal, doing this kind of dogged reporting that's a grave threat to Trump. Then on the other hand, you have Fox News and Fox Business, which are 24/7 propaganda, talking about, Obama and the Obama coup attempt and treason and all this stuff, as a way to distract. And so to kind of make sense of that, I still haven't really figured out what's going on there. If it's really, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, or if the Journal just has way more editorial independence than Fox News does. But, that's a really curious aspect of this is how, Rupert Murdoch, who has been so helpful to Trump overall since he launched his presidential bid in 2015, it's kind of simultaneously helping and hurting him. Trump is suing him, but then the Fox News is propagandizing for him. So it's very odd.
One point that I want to emphasize on top of all of that is let's not forget the fact that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell were monsters, and they left a lot of incredibly traumatized victims in their wake, and their stories are once again surfacing now. Some of these victims have stepped forward to address the media and do interviews, and the steps that that Trump's administration is now contemplating to further this cover up are going to bring that aspect center stage of Epstein's absolute criminality. And if they strike any kind of deal with Maxwell or pardon her or in some fashion commute her sentence, I think that's going to make things much, much worse for them. And we spend a lot of time focusing on the people who are basically, how to put it, uh, are very front and center in the political world, and politics is central to their identity. And they tend to have kind of a coherent worldview, even if it's completely screwed up, like the Benny Johnsons or the Charlie Kirks of the world. But there's also this much mushier world of folks like Joe Rogan, for instance, who I think has totally incoherent politics, who tend to get disgusted and turned off when Trump actually sucks up to or bends over backward for some of these disgusting people. We saw this happen with the Andrew Tate stuff. He's the, far right influencer who's accused of all kinds of sexual wrongdoing. And Trump helped him come back in this country. And when that happened, a lot of the Joe Rogan types were like, whoa, what the fuck is going on here? This is gross. I thought we were against, pedophiles or sex criminals or whatever. And those people, I think, had a lot to do with Trump's success in 2024. We know that Trump did well with folks who are not especially tuned into politics. And so if Trump loses the Joe Rogan world, again, for lack of a better term, then I think that causes him some real trouble. And the worse the cover up gets, and the kinder they are to a disgusting creature like Ghislaine Maxwell, I think the worse it
Mhm.
becomes for them with that mushy middle.
Yeah, and it was very notable yesterday. Newsmax kind of made the pivot across a couple of their shows to talking about Ghislaine Maxwell as a victim and all this. And so you can kind of
For
see where
real?
it's headed. Yes. Yeah. They use the
Oh,
term victim, to kind of coincide with Todd Blanche going to meet with her. And then, of course, he's meeting with her today. And so you can kind of see where this might be going. And we mentioned this earlier, but like, one thing to keep in mind if they really do, go forward with like a concerted cover up attempt is that one aspect of the journal's reporting on this is that there was apparently a whole FBI team that was going through the Epstein documents. And then that led to them to Pam Bondi reporting back to Trump that his name appeared multiple times in there. So, if they did have a whole team, I'm not exactly sure what the number of agents was that were going through that, but, any one of those people could leak, right? If they end up just trying to lie about this or withhold information, kind of, you know, pin the whole thing on Bill Clinton and Larry Summers and Trump today kept bringing up the former president of Harvard. I'm not exactly sure who that is, but apparently someone who he suspects
wait,
is in
is
the
that not
Epstein
Larry
files.
Summers? Larry
Maybe
Summers.
it's like that might be they might be one and the same person. Yeah, I know Larry Summers more from his being an economist. But
Right, right,
yeah,
right. No,
yeah,
but he
yeah,
was
yeah.
for a
So
while. Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, so it seems like the effort that Trump is making is to basically shift blame here, distract with the Obama stuff, and then shift blame to the Clinton and Larry Summers and people like that. But if it really is the case that all these different agents were combing through the files, that there's a lot of opportunities for people to start leaking there. And I would assume that unless they really kept a tight ship where they only had kind of politically reliable people doing that, that and again, even with the information surrounding the letter that Trump wrote to Epstein, you kind of have to wonder where these leaks are coming from. And I don't think that's totally clear at this point. But and then again, with like the victims, I mean, one of the Epstein victims was on MSNBC today, and she didn't have any explosive new information, but she talked about how she saw at Ghislaine, I believe it was Ghislaine Maxwell's house, where there was a framed photo of Trump and Epstein there. And so if they really tried to kind of rewrite history, maybe some of the victims would come forward, with information about them lying or something like this. So all of that kind of remains to be seen. But I guess it was definitely a big tell this week that Mike Johnson, instead of just it wouldn't cost that much to just be transparent, right? If Trump is really innocent here, you can redact the names of victims, like you can withhold information from whatever you release publicly that will protect the people that you want to protect here. But for whatever reason, they don't want to go that route, and they're kind of spinning their wheels to explain that. And mostly someone like Mike Johnson is only doing friendly, he goes on Fox, he goes on Newsmax to talk about this. He's not going on, Meet the Press or more, outlets that are actually going to kind of press him on this stuff. But again, the fact that they were canceling, that he opted to cancel Congress basically until September, instead of kind of hang in there, take the heat, maybe release some information to try to kind of satisfy people, I think shows that there's like a consciousness of guilt here. We just don't know exactly at this point. We know Trump is in there. We don't know in what context. But based on how he's acting, it seems like he at least suspects that more is coming here.
The Mike Johnson angle, I feel, is really underappreciated just how dramatic that is. That
Yeah.
he literally sent Congress on its recess early, and they're not going to reconvene until the fall, precisely to avoid greater scrutiny over Trump and Epstein. And we are living in such a perverse time that the less Congress does, the better. And so that's already a huge victory for
Mhm.
Democrats. If Republicans aren't there to keep passing more horrible legislation, or in the case of the Senate, to keep confirming terrible judges, that's good news. And
Yes.
so that's already a big victory, combined with the fact that polls, tons into the polls at this point, have shown that a lot of people believe that there is some kind of cover up going on right now. And for normie Democrats like myself, rolled our eyes at this stuff for years and years.
Yes.
Oh, Epstein
Me
Island,
too.
Epstein client list, and then all of a sudden, in the last week or two, wow, we're turned into believers here. There's got to
I
be something
know.
here, right? Like I never
Yeah.
expected that coming. So I think it's already been a multi-front victory for Democrats. Just
Yeah.
keeping your opponent on the defensive and scrambling is really important and underrated. And there's something else that I want to
Yeah.
emphasize. There was an
Yeah.
Axios report today that quoted some anonymous House Democrat, member of Congress, saying that they don't give a fuck about Epstein and they just want to
I
talk
saw
about
this.
health care. And
Yeah.
now I need to emphasize that is a minority view. Like I said, even Hakeem Jeffries is saying go, go, go. But Jesus Christ, first off, don't be stupid. Take advantage of this opportunity. But
Yes.
second off, they are not mutually exclusive. And here's what I mean by that. The best way Democrats have to communicate about this is to say Republicans would rather spend their time covering up what Donald Trump's involvement with a known sex criminal rather than help lower the cost of groceries for you.
Yeah.
And this is something that Republicans did super effectively, especially Donald Trump last year, because with his infamous ad attacking Kamala Harris about trans rights, it wasn't just, oh, Kamala Harris cares about trans people. It was Kamala Harris cares about trans people, and that means she doesn't care about you.
Yes.
And Democrats need to flip the switch or flip the script on this one and say this cover up of Epstein proves that Republicans don't care about you, and this works in any district of any lean, no matter how blue or how moderate or how conservative. You can rely on this message everywhere.
Yeah, it's a great point. And you even had Nancy Pelosi, who she was on MSNBC about a week ago, characterizing the Epstein stuff as a distraction. Was her direct? But then I saw that
Right?
she kind of flipped on that
She
as well.
she did.
And
Yeah.
is now kind of all in on it. So there is kind of blood in the water at this point.
Yeah.
And yeah, it kind of makes me feel a little bit like I'm on crazy pills because you know Michael Wolff, who obviously is a controversial journalist, author, I guess is probably more accurate because his books are always like very sensationalized. He has sources, but they're always kind of like quotes that seem too good to be true, sort of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he had the literal, he had taped interviews with Epstein not too long before his death, where he described Trump as his best friend for decades. And the tapes were released like 3 or 4 days before the election last November. And I guess I was aware of that. I kind of vaguely remember it, but it certainly didn't make big news. I think the Daily Beast had a write up, that I revisited this week, where they had some of the audio in there. But the fact that it didn't make any waves, because that's been a big Republican talking point now to kind of push back is like, if Democrats have such a sincere interest in this stuff, why didn't they talk about it during the campaign? Why was this a non-issue? Why didn't Merrick Garland, do something about this? Kind of setting aside they're projecting Trump's criminality onto Merrick Garland, where, yeah, of course, Trump, if there was information incriminating one of his opponents, he would release it or
Of
leak it
course.
somehow. But, Merrick Garland would not do that, probably to the detriment of our country. But it for whatever reason, this issue, which was kind of simmering, but not really a big deal, it just exploded the last month or so. And I do think that Trump really has himself to blame for some of the reasons that we talked about earlier. But I do want to pivot because these are related. Where you talked about Mike Johnson, essentially extending the recess for an extra week to essentially cancel Congress and cancel some votes that would have been tough on the Epstein related stuff. So it's obviously coming off the One Big Beautiful Bill, which is very regressive and is very unpopular. And so in part response, I think, to some of these political headwinds, the fact that midterms are just kind of problematic for the party in power as it is. There's a push now for partisan redistricting in Texas, which has kind of caught me off guard. I know you've covered it a little bit. And, I guess my question is, or sort of, maybe it's more of an observation than a question, but there seems to be an instance where kind of good governance is backfiring on Democrats because in Texas, to my understanding, basically they can redistrict to their heart's content. There is no kind of independent commission. There's very little checks on Republicans if they want to do this. And then in response to Texas, talking about they're going to do the special session, which is related to the flooding that happened, but they're also going to take up this possible redistricting, which would give them up to, I believe, like 5 or 6 would secure 5 or 6 House seats going into next year's midterms. Then you had Gavin Newsom, you had Wes Moore, Kathy Hochul, governors of blue states talking about kind of eye for an eye, all's fair in war. But a lot of these states, it's not as simple as it is in Texas because they have commissions. There's checks on basically the redistricting process that there isn't in a state like Texas. So, do you kind of view this, I guess, is your read that this really is sort of like almost a checkmate situation? Now, that's not to say that if Republicans pick up 5 or 6 seats, that it's insurmountable for them still to win enough seats elsewhere to make up the gap there. But is this really kind of like a masterstroke, or is there something like that a Gavin Newsom could do to maybe, go step for step with Republicans here?
I was really curious to know how you were going to segue us from Epstein to redistricting. Uh, yeah, but what's happening right now in this gerrymandering arms race is really, really alarming. And you're precisely right that in Texas, Republicans face very few obstacles to further gerrymandering that state's map. It's already extremely gerrymandered in favor of the GOP. They did uh, a devilish gerrymander just a few years ago, and they want to make it even worse to flip further Democratic seats. And you're also right that Democrats are limited in their ability to respond because so many blue states have adopted redistricting commissions of one stripe or another that take redistricting out of the hands of state lawmakers. And you're relating this to the question of good governance. In the abstract, independent redistricting commissions are a great idea because lawmakers, as we see, you leave them the pen in their hands to draw new maps, and they will simply draw maps to favor themselves. But the real problem is when you have a federal system of 50 separate states, if only the blue states are disarming and the red states are continuing to gerrymander, you've made things much, much worse because then you're making the anti democracy party, you're giving them the opportunity to run absolutely roughshod. Now, I will say this that as we've seen with the Epstein cover up, where Democrats have been surprisingly eager to embrace it and push it as a wedge issue, we are seeing most Democrats in elective office say, you know what? This unilateral disarmament is bullshit, and we have to fight fire with fire, eye for an eye, as you said. And the way I've been referring to it is they have to counter gerrymander. In other words, if Texas is going to do this, then other states have to respond in kind. But the commissions are a real, real problem. And California's commission, on the one hand, is a model. It's genuinely independent. It has it's set up in such a way that no one party can dominate it, and that it's really largely free from political influence. But that's a real problem at a time like this. And Newsom is supposed to be speaking this afternoon about this. But he has, in other interviews in the last week or so, talked about what California could do here. And what California, the most likely move that California could make would be for the state legislature to put an amendment on the ballot this year and have Newsom call a special election. And this amendment would be shaped in such a way that would allow California to redraw its congressional map in a more partisan way and outside of the usual every 10 years process. That's the other thing. What's happening right now, you're not supposed to redistrict in the middle of a decade. It's supposed to be
Yeah.
a once every 10 years thing. And so, there are obviously a lot of obstacles with Newsom's plan, though it does seem like the best one possible at the moment. And there are lots of ways you can frame this amendment because you can say, you can put in the amendment, if other states are gerrymandering, I mean, in some way, shape, or form, in proper legal language, but, if other states are gerrymandering, we are going to counter that so that the national map is fair. That we're not going to look just at California, we're going to look at all 50 states. And there are all kinds of ways to frame it that is actually anti-gerrymandering on the whole. And also, let me emphasize, Aaron, Democrats for years have pushed forward legislation in Congress that would eliminate the practice of gerrymandering congressional maps. Congress has the power to do this. In the Constitution, it says Congress can regulate elections. But of course, Republicans have obstructed these bills. And so gerrymandering remains legal on the federal level. So, in California is the state that can probably move fastest with this to sort of undo, I don't want to say undo its commission, but kind of revamp its commission. It's harder for other states to follow suit. For New York, it's much harder, for instance, to amend the state constitution. That's the other thing. These commissions are in the state constitutions. And amending a state constitution always is a heavy lift, in some states more than others. But Democrats have to think about fighting back, and it's good that they are. At the very least, even just the threat of fighting back might help.
Yeah, and there are still parts of the Voting Rights Act that are in effect. I know, we don't need to go down the full lineage of how we got to where we are with that, but so in theory, I guess, if the gerrymandering got too extreme in a place like Texas, I believe the most potent part of the Voting Rights Act that still applicable is racial gerrymanders are basically still illegal. So, I mean, would there be, is it kind of naive to think that, with especially with the Supreme Court being as corrupted as it is, that maybe they could even go too far for them? Texas could. What do you think the odds would be that, if Texas really went whole hog here and tried to carve out,
Yeah,
because that's the other thing is that Trump has not tried to conceal what the intent is here whatsoever. I mean, he was asked about this and he explicitly said, I hope they do it so we can get 5 or 6 more seats. I mean, the
yep,
idea that there's any sort of good faith reason to do this, that
right,
there's been
right.
population shifts or, post COVID migration has been so, we've had so many new people in Texas that we need to account for them. No, Trump just says straight up, I hope we get 6 more seats, basically. And so you would think that might, kind of hurt their chances if these maps are challenged. But I don't know if that ship has totally sailed. What's your read on that?
My strong suspicion is Texas, at least, will try to avoid the thicket of the Voting Rights Act and confine itself, the Republicans there will confine themselves to altering districts where the Voting Rights Act likely would not be implicated. Because the main provision of the Voting Rights Act that you're referring to is that minority voting power, language minorities and racial minorities, cannot be diluted. In other words, if you have an area, for instance, where Black voters should be able to elect their preferred candidate, which is almost always going to be a Black Democrat, and they're in a geographically coherent area, then you're not allowed to just chop that area up among a bunch of different districts to prevent Black voters, in this case, from electing the candidate of their choice. And there are a number of districts like that, both Black and Hispanic districts in Texas, that would likely be protected under the Voting Rights Act. But there are other districts where Republicans don't really face those issues. So my presumption is they may not be able to wring out 5 to 6 seats. That's pretty high. They might play it a little bit safer and try to avoid the Voting Rights Act. But the problem is you got Ron DeSantis talking about this too. And you mentioned something, Aaron. You talked about population influxes or population growth. Here's the thing: districts have to be drawn based on the decennial census. In other words, the census they do every 10 years. So even though we know it's 2025, the census was 5 years ago now, we're halfway through. Even though we know that those population numbers are no longer really accurate, districts still have to be drawn on that basis. The Supreme Court has said so. The Census Bureau produces estimates every year trying to update population growth, but they're just estimates. They're not the formal count that they do every 10 years. And so, I mean, it's possible, I guess, that Republicans could say that they want to draw new districts based on these estimates. I think that might even be a bridge too far for the Supreme Court.
Hmm.
But this is what DeSantis is claiming. He's claiming that our districts are malapportioned. Well, buddy, according to the law, you can't do jack about that. That's why we redistrict every 10 years. It
Right.
has to be done based on the census numbers. So look, but these justifications, Aaron, it doesn't fucking matter what they are. Like you said, I mean, Trump doesn't care about justifications. He's like, let's just
No.
do it because
Yes.
we need more seats. But DeSantis talks about malapportionment. Texas Republicans claim that there are constitutional or VRA infirmities in their districts, which they don't believe at all. They're just throwing whatever sticks at the wall, and ultimately, it doesn't matter. They're going to do whatever the hell it is they want to do.
Is there any way, like, I'm assuming in Texas that basically Republicans could just do this on a partisan basis, like there isn't sufficient amount of Democratic representation in the legislature to block any of this? Is that pretty much how it is down
So
there?
So the answer is yes and no. What
Hmm.
Democrats can do is they can walk out and deny a quorum to Texas Republicans. And do you remember the delay-mander, Aaron, from 20 years ago?
I
Does that
don't.
ring a bell? So more than 20 years ago now, Tom DeLay, who was the real GOP head honcho in the House, and he was from Texas, he convinced Texas Republicans to ram through a gerrymander, a mid-decade gerrymander that wound up targeting several Democratic incumbents. And Democratic lawmakers in the state tried to prevent it by walking out, and they actually fled the state so that Texas state troopers couldn't arrest them and drag them back to the state capitol. It's a very, very difficult thing to do, though, because the members of the legislature, these are part-time jobs, very part-time jobs in the case of Texas. So they have other jobs. These people
Yeah.
are, lawyers and doctors and, all school teachers, et cetera, and they have to work for a living.
Yeah.
And so leaving your home state for a prolonged period is very difficult. Also, there are fines that get imposed if you leave your home state. And then there's another thing, and you alluded to this, Aaron. The legislature wants to pass appropriations for flood relief for the victims of the terrible floods. And so what the plan appears to be is that Republicans will save the flood relief for the very end of the special session. And so if
Mm.
Democrats walk out or flee the state, then they'll be accused of holding up or blocking flood relief. So it's a very, very difficult situation. Hopefully, look, if it comes to it, I hope Democrats do it. If they don't, I'll understand because it's really difficult. And when the delaymander was happening more than 20 years ago, it ultimately didn't work. It's
Yeah.
really, really hard for this quorum busting walkout to succeed in the end.
Yeah.
But
And,
that
and,
is the
uh,
main tool.
And Democrats in Wisconsin, I believe, tried that during the Walker years once too, right? And that also did not. It was headline grabbing, but it didn't ultimately work. Hey, I
Yep.
did want to close though with the minutes we have
Yes.
left with some good news that I saw in the
Yes.
down ballot. That I've also been witnessing, just kind of watching right wing media, and that is the North Carolina Senate race where Roy Cooper, who is very popular ex governor, is now officially in, right? And
Not just
so,
yet.
oh, he is not. Okay, I thought I read that he was officially in, but
Multiple media outlets are reporting that he's about to get in, and
okay.
Cooper's team is doing nothing to tamp that down. So we're like 99%.
Okay, because the reason that I was thinking about this was it was one of the Trump events this week where, or maybe it was actually no, I think Laura Trump herself announced this on social media that there's a lot of speculation about her possibly running in North Carolina,
Right,
which
right, right.
would have been kind of a strange move because she lives in Florida. I mean, I know
Florida,
she like
yeah.
grew up in North Carolina, but she announced that she is not running,
Right,
and
right,
it
right.
seems like she. I don't know if she would have been a better candidate than Michael Watley, who coincidentally they were the two RNC chairs the previous election cycle, so they worked together. Watley is a lifelong, or at least in his adult life, has lived in North Carolina, so at least he has that going for him. He doesn't strike me as especially charismatic. I mean, he's certainly better than like Mark Robinson would have been, or someone like that. At least he's just kind of like a normal Republican. But I would assume that Cooper getting in is pretty much like a best case scenario in terms of
Oh,
Democrats
yeah.
flipping that seat. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is a good note to end on. So, North Carolina, one of the top two Senate targets for Democrats in 2026, the other one being Maine. And Cooper is absolutely the number one Democratic recruit. He has won statewide in North Carolina 6 times, 4 times as attorney general, twice as governor. His 2 wins as governor came when Trump was on the ballot and carried North Carolina. And he still remains very popular. And so it's a huge coup for him getting in. And of course, Republican Tom Tillis, he very unexpectedly wound up announcing his retirement after furiously opposing the big ugly bill or whatever you want to call it. And so Republicans now have to find a candidate too. And yeah, the Lara Trump thing, I mean, God, she's what, like a Fox News host or something? I mean, as
Yes.
someone with no political experience and very distant ties to the state. And so Trump just today endorsed Michael Watley for the Senate race. So I suspect he probably has the nomination sewn up. But 2026, the midterms should favor Democrats because, like you were saying earlier, Aaron, the party out of power usually does better in the midterms. And Cooper is the best possible recruit. I don't know that there's anything special about Watley. Obviously, he knows North Carolina really well. He had a lot of success there electing other candidates, but I don't think he's
Yes.
ever been on the ballot. So I would give Cooper maybe the slightest of edges right now, which is really remarkable to say because Democrats have not had a lot of success on the federal level in North Carolina. The last time they did win a federal race there was in 2008 when Obama and
Hmm.
Kay Hagan both won.
Yeah. And how long has Tillis been in the Senate? Quite a while, huh?
Just 2 terms.
Oh, just
I
two
know.
terms?
Oh, wait,
Okay.
hold on. Am I wrong about that? Yeah, just 2 terms because he beat Kay
Interesting.
Hagan in 2014, very narrowly ousted her, and then he won re-election in 2020. You might remember this was a race where Democrats were very optimistic about, and the Democratic candidate Cal Cunningham,
Mm,
he admitted to having an affair just weeks
mm.
before the election. Who knows if that was ultimately the deciding factor? Trump, like I said, carried the state that year. Cunningham lost pretty narrowly. But yeah, Tillis was only in the Senate for 2 terms, which makes him a whippersnapper by normal Senate standards.
Yeah, and certainly Tillis, he was doing an Axios panel this week, and he remained very critical of the Medicaid cuts. But I've noticed he's been voting for a lot of Trump's judicial
Of
nominees. Like
course.
it's not a Massey situation where kind of burn the boats behind you. And it seems like Massey is going to be, especially in the Epstein issue, annoying Trump indefinitely. It seems like Tillis is trying to at least kind of. He talked during this Axios event about the need to elect a Republican to replace him. Although he did have scathing comments about Mark Robinson, saying something to the effect of like he's the worst candidate that I've ever seen, kind of thing. And he did kind of tepidly, if it's Laura Trump, I could support her, and so anyway. But yeah, certainly Cooper getting in is good news. It's still going to be a tough map for Dems, but flipping that seat would go a long way toward giving them a shot, possibly, to retake the Senate.
Yeah, one of these days we should do maybe a deeper dive on like what the other reach targets for Senate Democrats are. But this is a good note to end on. We had 1,200 folks tune in today. Huge audience.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're sorry that we missed you last week, but I think we're going to be back on a regular week-to-week schedule here. So
Yep.
see us again at 2 p.m. Eastern time, 1 p.m. in Aaron's time zone. I believe that's called the Central Time Zone. I don't
That's
know,
right.
the East Coast elitists.
Yep.
Next Friday. Again, we always welcome your comments and questions in the chat here. You just need to be a paid subscriber to either publication. If you have not yet subscribed to Public Notice, please, I really strongly encourage you to. We have seen in recent months just how horribly the big corporate media has been captured by Donald Trump. I think you really cannot trust news coverage from much of the large corporate media anymore, or you have to look at it with extreme skepticism. And Public Notice, you can absolutely trust, because Public Notice, like the Down Ballot, a small independent site. We are not beholden to shareholders. We are not beholden to big corporate interests. We are not beholden to billionaire sugar daddies. We only tell the truth, tell it like it is. So please subscribe to Public Notice. If you're a Public Notice subscriber and you haven't yet subscribed to the Down Ballot, the kind of stuff we've been talking about the second half of this episode about gerrymandering and the Senate, that stuff we cover day in, day out. So if you're really interested in understanding the battlefield for the 2026 midterms, please also sign up for the Down Ballot. Everybody, have a wonderful weekend.
See you next week.